will be recorded. This will be recorded.
Yes, it will be. Alan, we are live.
Welcome. I am Alan Benson, and once again, AAI, the African American Initiative, is offering a discussion on issues of importance and relevance. Now, it is a pleasure to introduce this legislative summit featuring voter participation and challenges. Now, AAI is a policy initiative organized in 2010, featuring a wide array of primarily African American stakeholders, leaders, and operatives that come together to discuss and address the issues that confront the African American community. As we speak, the election process in many states is beginning or taking place. It is a fundamental activity that is calculated in our democratic process that determines who will represent you and me in our respective areas on the local, state, and national level. Now, what is the state of democracy in the United States? What do we have to gain or lose as a nation? How do we ensure our voice, and why is it that important? Now, we are pleased to co-host this event with AARP of Kentucky and Cy Boulay of Sigma Pi Phi Fraternity Incorporated. We are also pleased that we have a continuing relationship and collaborative relationship with WLOU Radio, who is simulcasting this event at 1350 on your dial as we live stream on Facebook Live and later to be posted on YouTube. AAI gives special recognition to the National Black Caucus of State Legislators and the Kentucky Legislative Black Caucus for their continuing work on the front lines of our nation's capitals, fighting for truth, justice, and equality. At this time, please welcome Kentucky State Senator Gerald Neal, who will serve as our moderator. Senator Neal.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you very much for the introduction, and good evening. I'm pleased to moderate this AAI Summit on voter participation and challenges. It has been confirmed that our most recent election of 2020 was secure and the most accurate that has been held in the United States of America to date. Yet, it is also clear that there are those that are intent on manipulating public opinion contrary to that fact for their own interests. This raises serious questions. What are the historical and current challenges to our democracy? What is your role in promoting the health of the greatest democratic experiment on the face of the earth? How do we get involved? We welcome a distinguished, diverse panel that offers us varying perspectives and content, which includes Jacqueline Stamps, a voter engagement specialist representing AARP of Kentucky, who will give us a 50s and older perspective. We also have Eugene Mazo, Professor Mazo, who holds a Juris Doctor and serves as a professor of law at Seton Hall University School of Law in New Jersey. He will provide a historical and current national look at the dynamics. We have Aaron Huber, a representative of the Jefferson County Clerk's Office, who provides a practical process of voting on a local level. And their focus this time is here on Kentucky and how it adjusted to the impact on COVID-19. We have Louis Barefoot, who holds a Juris Doctor and an associate of the law firm of West and Associate LLP in Dallas, Texas, who gives a young generational perspective, an involved perspective. He also serves as a presiding judge for Dallas County Elections Central Count Station. So welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us today for what I'm sure will be an engaging process, discussion. So I'm going to start today with our folks. I'm going to do it somewhat randomly, but I'm going to start with Aaron Huber. Aaron, please give us whatever touches you in the context of this discussion and share with our listeners.
Well, thank you so much. I'm very honored and privileged to be part of such a distinguished group. I really appreciate the invitation to be able to speak a little bit more on some of the facts on the ground as it specifically relates to Jefferson County, which is the most populous county within Kentucky. I'm so pleased to be able to join everyone on Zoom, on Facebook Live, and WLOU. So thank you all very kindly. I wanted to talk a little bit about what I do. I am the Director of Communications for the Jefferson County Clerk's Office. So it's my job to help communicate a little bit more to the people through the media typically about what goes on with government services and local services. And that can be anything from the duties that the clerk has to take care of people's motor vehicle registrations, to take care of people's land records. Essentially, Bobby Hoscall, the Jefferson County Clerk, serves as the file keeper for the county. But within those files, that also includes our elections to help keep track of not only how the vote goes, but to be able to keep track of how historical votes have gone in the past. So I'm very pleased to be able to speak a little bit more today on how voting works in Jefferson County and address some of the concerns people may have about the process in a fact-based manner.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm sure that in your role that you've seen a lot, and there's a lot that you have to deal with. And perhaps as we go forward, we'll get into more of that. Professor Mazo, please give us some insight into your role and your perspective with respect to the subject matter today.
Well, thanks, Senator Neal, for having me. My name is Gene Mazo. I'm a voting rights scholar, a professor of election law at Seton Hall. I've written 3 books about voting rights and election law, and I'm on my 4th. My remarks are just very brief. As we all know, democracy in the United States is imperfect. It's not a perfect system. In fact, far from it. And to give you some perspective about why that is, I could tell you something that maybe you know or maybe you don't, and that is very simple. The original Constitution that was adopted in 1787, our founding document, our country's founding document, didn't actually guarantee anybody the right to vote. It still doesn't guarantee anybody the right to vote. It's been amended many times, and those amendments have prevented us from discriminating against African-American voters, against women when it comes to voting, against young people under the age of 21 when it comes to voting. It prevents us from having things like poll taxes, but it doesn't guarantee the right to vote to anyone. And because of this, the rules of democracy are constantly being fought over by the parties. Actually, for all of us, most of us, the right to vote comes from our states. It's the state that actually gives you the right to vote, and it's our state governments that regulate voting. And originally voting was restricted to adult white males, and eventually it sort of expanded slowly to other demographics, African Americans, women, paupers, migrants. It's never expanded to felons, for example. Because the states enfranchise voters, the states also disenfranchise voters, and historically, especially Black voters, and especially in the South, and they've used all kinds of devices to do that. And some of you may know these, but poll taxes used to exist. People had to pay a tax to vote. In other words, it was tied to wealth. Literacy tests, secret ballots, primary elections in which only certain people or people of certain races could vote. And today, the states continue to try to control voters in lots of different ways through laws that require you to prove your citizenship, or laws that force you to vote with an ID with a voter ID card, or cuts in early voting, or laws that purge certain voters from the voter rolls. And we'll get into some of those discussions if Senator Neal wants to go that way. We've had very little, and I'll sort of end here, very little federal legislation that actually protects the right to vote. The major piece of federal legislation that does that is a law passed in 1965 called the Voting Rights Act, which has been kind of attacked by the Supreme Court in recent years, ever since 2013, in a decision called Shelby County versus Holder, and another decision that was handed down last year, a different part of the Voting Rights Act.
Well, hold that thought, because I'm going to want to definitely come back to that piece right there. I think we can pivot from there.
Yeah, so I'll just stop here and say that voting, last thing, is a political struggle for all of us in the country. The right to vote is expanded when people struggle for it, fight for it, and so I'll end there, and we'll keep the conversation going. Thank you.
Very good point. Thank you for that. And we also have with us Jacqueline Stamps with AARP of Kentucky. That's going to give us a perspective that I've increasingly embraced, and that of those over 50. Would you please, Ms. Stamps, give us some indication of your thoughts as it relates to the subject matter? You're on mute.
Thank you, Senator Neal, and thank you for inviting me tonight to talk about the work that AARP is doing around voter engagement. And as you can see behind me, the phrase that AARP is using this year is 50 voters 50 plus, our voices decide. And that is because of the power of voters that are 50 plus years of age. People over 50 are the nation's most consistent voters, and they can be the deciders in this 2022 election and beyond. You know, AARP has a 30-year history of nonpartisan voter education and engagement, and it doesn't endorse any candidate, but collects data and research around how people vote and when they vote and how to access voting better for seniors. And it also provides voters with information on where the candidates stand. An interesting fact to note is that in Kentucky, in the 2016 election, voters 50 plus represented 54% of all the voters. In 2020, 50 plus voters represented 56.7% of all voters. Turnout from voters 50 plus increased by 14% in Kentucky from 2016 to 2020, and turnout of voters 65 plus increased by 27%. Specifically also among African-American voters, most African-American voters over the age of 50 say they always vote in national elections to the percentage of 69%. Statewide elections, 37%, and local elections, 54%. Women age 50 plus make up a large and increasing share of registered voters. So it's there's no question that this block of voters make decisions that affect the whole country. But we know that this is not a single block. They are very diverse voters that are part of 50 plus, and I hope to be able to talk about more what those issues are that the 50 plus population is addressing and why these real life situations are increasing their willingness to engage and to come out and vote.
Well, we're looking forward to that, which is something now, if we're looking at it from a generational standpoint, we have the opportunity to hear from Louis Bedford, who is a Juris Doctor, the attorney on this particular piece, but has this unique perspective on this, your long engagement. I understand since you were 18 years old that you've been involved in this. You're not far from that now, are you?
No, I'm not. I'm only 29 years old, Senator Neal, but I want to first off and say thank you for having me. It is definitely an honor and a privilege in order to be able to be here. But as you were saying, I've spent the majority of my adult life focusing on voting rights. And for my background, I'm a voting rights attorney, voting rights advocate, voting rights educator, and I'm also the presiding judge of the Dallas County Central Count Station, which ultimately means if there's a way for me to get my hands on voting rights, I'm going to actively try to do so. But I do want to talk about one thing about why voting matters. It is one of the true ways for we to be able to hold our elected officials accountable. And it's one of the ways that we're able to have a voice in a system that actively tries to keep us voiceless. But it's also one of the major ways that we are able to make sure that we are able to participate by empowering ourselves, but also empowering the people around us. And as Professor Mezzo said, this is a political struggle, but it's also more than that. This is also a struggle for our humanity. This is also a struggle for our own morality as well. And I just want to be able to say that because it's the truth. In order for us to continue to have a place in society, we must do our best in order to participate any way we possibly can. So if that means protesting, that also means voting, that means boycotting, that means participating in as many different ways as possible to make sure that we can be heard. And lastly, before we go into this group discussion, there's a quote that I live by, and it's by Frederick Douglass. It says, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will." So as we go through and we talk about voting, it's very important that we make sure that we remember that in order for us to truly seize power, in order for us to empower ourselves, we have to demand it. And that means doing so at the voting booth, doing so at city council hearings, doing so at county commissioner hearings, doing so at the state legislature, doing so in as many different ways as possible to make sure that our humanity, our voices are heard.
Well, I think the stage is set. I think it's clearly set. All the way from the practical, all the way to the challenges, and something I bet a lot of people didn't know that Professor Mezzo provided is that there's no right established under the Constitution. That's going to be an interesting discussion as we go. But also that there's a struggle, that all of this, it's a struggle that deals with who sets the agenda, who has the power to do that. And it's the voice of those that underlie all of that. So I think we got the stage set here. So I'm going to start with the practical. I'm going to go to Aaron Huber, because I'm going to ask him a very fundamental question. And that question is, why is voting important?
Well, thank you, Senator. I appreciate you letting me kind of start things off in terms of a wider discussion. It's important to recognize that from the beginning of the United States, the founding fathers recognized the right to vote as crucial to the future of the country. Now, Professor Mezzo is correct in that the right to vote is not enumerated in the Constitution. That is, it's not specifically written out. But over the years, amendments to the Constitution and legislation across the country have recognized voting as a right by outlining that voting cannot be restricted for reasons like race, color, age, and labels of biological definition. The Constitution states that the right of citizens to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex in the 19th Amendment. So the importance of voting isn't just recognized as critical with so many laws around it, it also is through how we put into action that right to vote and how it affects our future. Voting is the single most effective way to share your point of view on how you would like things to move forward in your community in terms of elected leadership and in terms of policy that makes an impact. It is democracy in action, and to help ensure that your voice counts at the ballot box, the Jefferson County Clerk's office works diligently to ensure access to a free, fair, and secure election process.
Well, I tell you what, that raises a lot. I'm glad that we have Professor Mezzo here, because this whole question of right or not right, it seems like in reality, a nebulous reality, because some people do not get to vote, Professor Mezzo. Could you clear this up with us? Why is it that some people do not get to vote?
So when the issue of voting came to the framers, when they were drafting the Constitution, it was very late in the convention. And all of the colonies regulated voting in lots of different ways. And the founding fathers knew that they just couldn't agree on a single procedure. And so they just decided to write into the Constitution the one clause that at the time concerned voting. And it said, however you vote for your state legislature is the same way you're going to elect your members of the House of Representatives, right? It's Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution. And what the Constitution says, as Aaron said, it doesn't say African Americans have the right to vote or women have the right to vote. It's written in the negative sense. It says the right to vote shall not be abridged or denied on the basis of race or on the basis of sex or gender. That means if the state gives somebody the right to vote, a woman the right to vote, they can't take it away, but they don't have to give it to you in the first place. That's the way the Constitution is written. It's written in the negative sense. So no state has to open up voting rights. Once the state does, we can't discriminate based on race or gender. And I think that's a very important point. It's subtle, but it's very important. The Constitution does not guarantee you the right to vote. If it did, we wouldn't have the battles we're having right now in America. I'll stop there and we can jump in.
I think you raised it. I'm looking at both of you and I'm listening to both of you all, and someone out there is confused. Someone out there is confused. I understand it from a historical standpoint, but I can't. I mean, I was raised all my life. You turn a certain age, you're eligible. So I guess that's when you've been given the right to vote. That's the right that's given. that can't be taken away on the basis of race or gender
Not
or
a
some of
federal
those other
right.
areas.
It's a state right.
But what you're saying is that the state did not have to give that, which suggests to me that now it is a right. Is that correct?
Yes and no. The state, your right to vote comes from your state government. Voting is regulated state by state by state. It's not a federal right. And so the right to vote has been given to the citizens of the Commonwealth of Kentucky by the Constitution and by the legislature. It's the same way in almost every state. And the right to vote is regulated by your state constitutions. It's not a federal right. Now, we do have Supreme Court cases where the Supreme Court has said the right to vote is fundamental. Yeah, it's fundamental, but that doesn't mean you have the right to do it in the first place. To give you a perfect example, when we used to, first of all, members of the Senate until 1913 were appointed by state legislatures. There was no right to vote for senators until an amendment passed. State electors who go and elect the president were appointed by legislatures. We didn't have a popular vote for presidential electors. State legislators appointed that, and then the states changed their laws and said, okay, now the people can elect electors. Can the state take that right away? Of course it can. Of course it can.
So Jacqueline Stamps, you've heard this piece. So let's assume we're not going to fight over whether it's a right or privilege or whatever, but what is it? Let's assume now that anyone that meets a certain level of eligibility as defined by a state can vote. What does that mean, and who votes? What demographic really takes advantage of that from your experience with respect to AARP and beyond?
Well, and I definitely think that voters 50 plus take advantage. They recognize the struggles, particularly for African Americans, that have gone into being able to just register to vote. And luckily, in the last few decades, there have been intense efforts to engage the population around 50 plus around the need to vote. That if you don't exercise that power, then none of the rights that you have earned and deserve are going to be afforded to you. No one's going to just give you the things that you need in life if you do not exercise the power that you have. And I think for African Americans and for the general population 50 plus, there is that recognition. And the issues that they want addressed are real life issues and things that they have seen that have been accomplished by their kind of getting out to vote.
Well, okay, so I have it. In other words, this is not something that operates automatically. You have to assert yourself to engage the process in order to express yourself through vote. But I'm hearing, at least it's my experience, that certain demographics do not vote as aggressively as others. The 50 and over crowd, so to speak, has a better track record in voting as opposed to those under that. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I mean, and some of the numbers that I talked about before, I mean, basically, when you look at the 2020 election, 50 and older voters came out in numbers that were more than all the other age categories combined. And that basically helped them to be able to set the stage in terms of what it is that we want to happen from these candidates and focus the candidates' actions on what it were the issues of older Americans. And we've seen that very clearly here in Kentucky and here in Louisville particularly. We did a mayoral survey. There are 12 candidates running for mayor in Louisville, and it's been a while since the mayor has been elected. So this is a really important primary. And AARP sent out a letter to all of the candidates saying, these are the issues that are important to Americans 50 plus and in Louisville. And we want you to respond in writing to what your plan is on how you're going to address these issues. And 7 of those 12 candidates responded in writing, and those answers are posted on our website at aarp.org/Louisville. And even now, as as I've been listening to some of the candidates over the last several days, they're focusing more on issues around people 50 plus, because they're recognizing the power of those voters and that those voters will get out and vote. So I do think that it is really critical that we recognize the power of voting but make sure the candidates know that we're going to hold them accountable. And because of the reach of AARP, they're able to do that in a very extensive way, both nationally and locally. And by getting that information to the members, it supports, their being more engaged in the voting process.
So Lewis, this question, it begs the question of the demographic that's younger than the 50. Where are they? My experience has been that there's less of voter participation at the younger ages, particularly as you get down toward the 18s and the early 20s, but on through the 30s. What's your experience on that? And could you give us some understanding of why that is so?
Well, Senator Neal, I think you bring up a great question. And I think the reality is, unfortunately, a lot of the elected officials don't necessarily look like the younger demographic. There aren't a whole lot of elected officials who are necessarily in that age range, so to speak. So people feel that personal connection. So whenever they go to vote, they know that is someone that is going to have similar values to them. And the unfortunate reality is for a lot of young people, and I can only speak from my personal experience, but whenever they go speak to legislators, they realize that their own values aren't akin to their own. And they also aren't in positions of power in order to hold those elected officials accountable. So whenever they do want to call into question how someone is voting on a particular issue, or try to make sure that they're able to elevate people who have similar values and ideals to that of their own, they unfortunately aren't in a situation in order to be able to do that. And because of that, unfortunately, the whole situation can seem overwhelming at times, because if we aren't in a position in order to make the changes that may seem very clear and obvious to us, and we are in a situation where we are leaving our future, and whether it's economic future or whether it's our political future or whether it's a future around healthcare, to people who don't necessarily have our values, we are finding ourselves in a situation where we can only push so much. And the reality is, a second part of this, it is very difficult at times to truly understand the importance of the elections. And let me give you an example of what that looks like. In the state of Texas this year alone, there's a possibility we could have 5 different elections. We're going to have our March primary runoff for some of our federal legislators. And if there's a possibility that they didn't meet that 50% threshold, they're going to have a runoff. And then we're also going to have municipal races as well. And if they don't meet the 50% threshold, they're going to have a runoff for that as well. And then we also have the November general election. And when you add up the sheer number of elections time and time again, people unfortunately begin to question, why do I keep on needing to show up when there are so many elections that I have to continue to show up for? What is the true value of showing up for these elections if we're simply going to have so many of them? But that's the part where I like to push back, and I like to say all politics are local. The more local it is to you, the more likely it is, the more that you have to vote. Because if we're worried about our pocketbooks, if we're worried about our student loans, those are the people that we need to push. We need to make sure that we're pushing not just our state and federal legislators, but we also need to be pushing our local legislators as well, to making sure that there's an infrastructure in place in order for us to be successful. If we are worried about owning a home, we can vote at the federal level all we want to, but if we aren't focusing on what's happening at home as well, we're going to have a hard time seeking and seeing the true gains that we want to have happen.
Well, Aaron, what I'm hearing here is I'm hearing there's, we have the ability to vote. It can be trying and confusing to some people, depending on their demographic. There are some people feel that they do not have an impact necessarily, or it's relevant for them to vote. And I'm sure there's a whole lot of other things that are floating around in that particular dynamic. But you are right there at the crux. Just like it is probably obviously done differently in various states, but you were there at the point where there's a ballot cast, and not only is a ballot cast, someone has to count that ballot as well and then report it and validate it, et cetera. So what does your office do to promote accessibility and to protect that right to vote?
Well, thank you for asking. And in terms of accessibility, when it comes to things like physical handicap, all of our polling locations are ADA compliant. We want to make sure that no one has any physical barriers to entry when they come to cast their vote. We're really proud of the fact that TARC, which is our local bus system for those who may be outside of the area, it's a transportation authority of River City, has graciously stepped up to say that, hey, on primary election day, it's going to be fare free. This is not a case of where there are specific rides to specific polls. This is not a case where you have to go to a specific location to where you can take advantage of bus routes. All of the routes are free. And there is also something called TARC 3, which is accessible transportation for those who may have a physical limitation. So if you may be a person who uses a wheelchair or may have a little bit of trouble moving around, TARC 3 will be operating that day to make sure that you can get to the polls. In terms of outreach, we also make sure that we're on site for all kinds of different events that are in our community. No matter the age range or the demographics, from the Kentucky State Fair all the way to World Fest, we try and target a diverse range of events so that we can target a diverse range of people when it comes to trying to get people to register to vote. And we make sure that registering to vote isn't something that you can just do when you check a box to get your driver's license. Speaking of which, if you are a person who does not have a driver's license, we make sure that having an ID in Kentucky and the requirements to have an ID in Kentucky of some sort are not a barrier. There is SB 2, which was recently signed into legislation to ensure that everybody has free access to a state ID. And if somebody does not have a state ID, all they have to do is sign a voter oath form, and then they can basically, it asks them why they may not have an ID, and they can use some other form of identification to vote, whether that is a student ID, or they may be using a SNAP card, EBT, or they could use a credit or a debit card, their social security card. So our goal for the Jefferson County Clerk's office is to have as much participation as possible when it comes to our elections, because we're not concerned about whether someone may have a certain belief or a certain opinion or may value a certain candidate. We want to make sure that anybody who wants to have their voice represented in our society has the chance to do so at the ballot box.
Okay, well, that's all well and good, and I'm trusting. In fact, when you look at this last election, even across the states, I think you find that generally to be true, what you just said, and it certainly has been my experience. However, Professor Mazo, I'm going to refer to you as Eugene, if I may.
Sure.
We haven't had a history necessarily of getting that person who's sitting at home that has a quote unquote right to the ballot box where they can cast that vote and their voice can be heard historically. And yet we still have those struggles now, generally referred to as voter suppression or some other terms that are used. What's going on across the nation, not necessarily in Jefferson County, because I'm gonna come back to Aaron, because we've done something kind of unique in Kentucky, and I think it's going to be interesting to discuss. But what has happened that is still happening? Let's say perhaps in Texas, perhaps in Georgia, or somewhere else in the United States.
Sure. So to take a little bit of a perspective on it, before the 1960s, states would prevent certain people from voting. Now nobody really prevents you from voting. They just burden your right to vote by making it a little bit harder. Politicians care about two constituencies: voters and donors. If you don't vote, nobody cares about you, or you want to call them constituents and contributors. And state legislatures know very, very well who's voting, what the demographics are, where these people are located. And so, as I explained to you, the right to vote comes from your state, and just as it can be given to you, it can also be taken away. You can't discriminate between different people, but what the states are doing is they're playing around with voting. Some states require an ID, other states don't. Some states have early voting, other states don't. Some states realize, hey, these people are voting early. We don't want those people to vote as much, so they just make fewer days of early voting. Some states are taking polling locations and they realize who uses that polling location more often, and they're pulling them farther apart, or they're changing the locations around. I mean, this goes on, we can go state by state, but just to get a general idea, because we don't have to do that, this changes from election to election to election. I'll give you an example. In the last election, because COVID was happening, many of the states moved to absentee voting. Now, in some states, you have to have an excuse to vote by absentee. In Louisiana, you got to tell the state why you want to vote absentee. It's not a no excuse state. You can't just get an absentee ballot. So some states went to absentee voting, and some states have allowed that to keep happening. Other states have taken that right away. And they've said, you want to vote by absentee, you got to go request a ballot. It doesn't just come to you automatically. So what the states do is they play with these rules at the margins, and that affects certain people. It affects certain demographics more than other demographics. If I take your polling place and I'm moving an hour away from where you live, and you got to travel for an hour to go cast your ballot, the state legislators know perfectly well you're just much less likely to go travel that hour to vote. So that's what's happening around the country. After the last election, where no one has yet been able to prove that there was any fraud, in some states, legislators believe that there is fraud. And so they're coming up with all kinds of tools and gimmicks and devices, which they have the right to do as the state legislature, to make voting harder for some people and easier for other people.
Well, let me just say this. Let me just say this, just being a state legislator, I don't believe there are many state legislators that believe that there was fraud in one of the most secure elections in the United States history. They say that, but I can't give them a pass because I talked to too many state legislators across the country, and I can't believe that. It gets to the point of stupid at some point. I think it's more of a question of posturing for some to leverage their position politically to do some of the things that ultimately requires this, what? Power. If you're not in the position to win the election, if you don't have the majority in the legislature, you do not have the ability to set the agenda. And it's about setting the agenda. So I just want to put my 2 cents in there, because I hear the media saying that all the time. But let me just ask a quick question, Jacqueline. I want to get back to Aaron because I think Aaron has made some really key points here, and I want to ask him about what happens from county to county. Jacqueline, that 54%, I believe you cited as related to those who participate demographically in terms of the vote. Is that overall, or is that African-American community, or what?
That was overall in Kentucky, yes.
In Kentucky, okay, I want to get that. And Louis, I think I cut you off. Were you getting ready to say something?
Senator Neal, I just wanted to add on to what Professor Mezzo was saying is I just want to provide a very clear-cut example. In the state of Texas, you have to register to vote for an election 30 days before the election. And when in states like Illinois, they have same-day voter registration, which means you could show up and vote on the same day. Those are the major differences that we're talking about. But also on top of that, it's how many voting machines are inside each polling location. How many workers does that polling location have? Those are all the different things that can add up to be voter suppression. It's not necessarily saying you can't enter, but it's about increasing the number of barriers that exist in order to limit your access to the polls, slow your ability in order to be able to go through the line. All those things ultimately add up, which can ultimately lead to you not voting at all. And to give you an even better example, during the 2020 March primary in the state of Texas, some voters had to wait in line for almost 6 and 7 hours to be able to vote, just to be able to vote in the primary, not even in the general election. And those are the kinds of things that ultimately end up happening, where it's not just one barrier, it's not just two, but all these little small hurdles end up stacking on top of each other, where it's not just one step that you have to mount, it's a whole staircase.
I'll give you another example if I could piggyback on Lewis's example. In the state of Arizona, after the last election in 2020, Arizona changed some of its rules. So now if you vote outside of precinct, so if you go to vote in the right county, but in the wrong voting precinct, most states will give you a provisional ballot. And then if you go prove, who you are, they'll count it later. Arizona said, we're just not going to count your vote if you vote outside of precinct. Not only that, but what some people call ballot harvesting, or in New Jersey, they call it a bearer of a ballot. In other words, if you get an absentee ballot and you're a disabled person, you can allow your sister or brother or someone else to take that ballot and mail it into the mailbox, where usually they have to write an affidavit. Arizona said, nope, you got to do it all by yourself. South Carolina said, you want to vote by absentee ballot, you're going to have to get that ballot notarized with an affidavit and a witness signature that you are to prove who you are. Well, if you have to get the ballot notarized, you got to leave your house and go somewhere to do that, unless you got a notary public who lives in your house. And so the point of voting absentee, so states are constantly playing with these rules. They're changing all the time. If we had this meeting in 2 years, the laws in some of the states would have changed. They would have been totally different, because the legislatures look at what's happening and adjust the rules accordingly. And it's our responsibility as voters to say, wait a second, some of these rules are unfair to certain groups. Some of these rules are unconstitutional. And even if we have the rules, I'm going to vote. I vote in every election. You want to change the rules? You want to move the polling place farther, 2 blocks away, 5 blocks away, 1 mile away? Don't care. I'm going to vote in every single election, every single one. Right now, if it's harder for you to vote, that means my vote counts more. So, and your vote doesn't actually count for anything. It's that when you're able to take your vote and aggregate it with other people who are like-minded, then you have power. When you find people who think the same way you do, have the same life experience, want the same policies, and you get them together in a room and you start aggregating those votes, then you have power.
Yeah. Well, Aaron, let me get back to you, because I want to understand something. Something really different happened in Kentucky, and I'm thinking this happened in some other states as well. And I'm going back to the era of COVID-19. Because and Aaron, correct me if I'm wrong on this, I think I'm right on it. Kentucky's voting processes were more restrictive than they are now. They were less restrictive during the COVID emergency than they are now. Now, what I just said was, we fell somewhere in the middle because of the challenges of COVID, but came up with a system that from a bipartisan standpoint was embraced in Kentucky. So I'm just curious, did I state that correctly, Aaron, or could you elucidate a little bit on that?
Sure. So COVID was and does continue to be a concern. It was most particularly a concern during the 2020 election, because we were dealing with a deadly virus for which no vaccines were available, no treatments were available. And when you have an unprecedented situation, it requires an unprecedented response. So to try and keep everyone safe, I would not necessarily say that we were more restrictive in terms of how we took our approach towards our COVID response, but we tried to make it as convenient as possible within the boundaries that were set by a literal health emergency. There was no active effort to be restrictive when it comes to the voting process. In fact, when we selected the Kentucky Fair and Exposition Center, it was because that was a central location. We're not saying that, oh, you used to vote down the street and now you have to drive half an hour away. We're saying, okay, to make it as fair as possible for everyone, we're going to pick one location that we can use that is big enough, number one, to be able to accommodate social distancing, and number two, is the most fair for everyone in the county in a centralized location. And quite frankly, we served as a national model in terms of showing everyone else across the country how to conduct an election in the middle of a pandemic. We were ready, we were prepared, we came up with a plan, and we were engaged with the community, because the Kentucky Fair and Exposition Center is not our space. So it took an effort. Sorry.
Let me say this, and I agree with you. I really agree with you. In fact, I was impressed at how that happened. Some people were critical. I think at one point, a group of people showed up late and they couldn't vote in a timely way or something like that. But that was sort of like, in Jefferson County at least, that was sort of like something happenstance type of situation. But overall, it appeared to me that voting was opened up, basically, in terms of that particular piece. But now we have a system now that particular emergency is not the emergency that has guided the legislature in terms of where we are now. I would say that we are less restrictive now than we were before COVID, but I would say we're somewhat more, and I don't say it as a critical or purist position, or maybe I am taking a purist position, that we're somewhat more restrictive than we were during the emergency. Is that a fair statement?
So I guess it would depend on how you define restrictive, because my understanding is that
let me help you.
Sir.
More you have more time to you have no calls, absentee ballots across the board. We don't have that. We had that during the emergency. You have a time early voting. If I remember correctly, was broader. Then it's less now to a couple of weekends or something in this neighborhood. Something to that effect, etc. To me, that would mean now it's more restrictive. Doesn't mean it's not workable, but to me, it's more restrictive. Does that make sense?
I think I understand a little bit more now. And when we were dealing with COVID in 2020, as mentioned, we were dealing with an unprecedented set of circumstances, and that demanded an unprecedented response. So we did see several additional weeks that allowed for the in-person process to be able to take place. However, the good part about what we saw from the pandemic in terms of voting is how it's impacted 2022. A bipartisan effort in our legislature made it so that a lot of the things that we saw that worked on the ground as we were making as many accommodations as possible to preserve the right to vote did in fact serve as a good idea. So what we have seen so far in this election is we have continued with mail-in absentee ballots. We also have an expansion in terms of our absentee voting for in-person. So we offered 6 days in conjunction with the legislation that was passed of we offered 6 days of excused in-person absentee voting, which meant that if you were a person who was anticipating being in the hospital, or you had a person in the hospital, you could come and vote in person at our election center on 1000 East Liberty. If you are a snowbird and you were going to be out of the state at the time that the election was going on, that was another reason for you to be able to come vote. If you worked out of the state during the time period that you are intending to go vote for a regular election day, then that was another reason. You say you're a long haul trucker and you're not able to be in the state on election day. That was another reason. But in addition to our in-person excused absentee voting, we just wrapped up no excuse in-person absentee voting. And we had 3 days of that. We had Thursday, we had Friday, and we had a Saturday in case people have to work during the week and they want to come on a Saturday to vote. So that's something new for this year too, is to say, hey, we're not going to ask you anything about why you may not be able to vote on election day. You can come to one of 6 locations that we had spread out throughout the county. We had, whether it was in West Louisville or all the way over in J-Town, whether it was the Kentucky Center for African American Heritage, or it was the Sun Valley Community Center, or we even had something back at the fairgrounds. We said, okay, we see that this worked last time. We're going to give it another go. We're still in a test and adjust period. This is the first time that we've been doing it like this. Yeah. But again, we saw what worked in 2020, and in a bipartisan effort with our legislature, we are working to make sure that we carry those good ideas over.
Yeah, and I'm gonna toss this over to Louis and to Jacqueline. Jacqueline, if you be patient with me just for a second, I want to toss it over to Louis for a second, because it doesn't get to that voting on the same day. It doesn't get into I call it no fault voting throughout the entire period. with respect to that. And there's some other mechanisms. Yet, for Kentucky, that's a big deal. I'd have to say. So I can't be critical. I can only say, could we have done more? I guess we should say, and that's above Aaron's pay grade. I'm not going to put him on the spot for that. But Lewis, you heard what he just said with respect to that. Where did Kentucky fall short from your perspective in terms of your view of voting excess, et cetera?
Well, I do want to say this just to put it in context. I think with some of the efforts that were made during the height of the pandemic in order to expand voting access, I think unfortunately some states overcorrected in the opposite direction and ended up restricting that, whether it's limiting the number of early voting days that people can show up to the polls, whether it's limiting who is eligible in order to be able to vote by mail. Those are all of the things that can ultimately end up leading to people not being able to show up and vote in an election, regardless of when and where that election is. So I also want to put this in context as well, whenever we're talking about voting access, that even despite the fact that we are creating different methods in order for people to be able to vote, if we aren't allowing to be able to vote in a manner, if, when, and how they choose to vote, for me, at least, that is a form of voter suppression. Because ultimately, if we're making it difficult in order for someone to be able to vote, regardless of how easy that process could be, if we make it a little bit more difficult, that means, unfortunately, people aren't going to be able to go. And let me put this in context. If you have 24-hour voting, that means someone could show up to vote, whether it's 2 a.m. in the morning or 2 a.m. in the afternoon. If you restrict that to just 12 hours, so someone can only vote between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m., there are people who might not be able to vote during that time period. That is a form of voter suppression because you are limiting the ability for someone to be able to vote if they aren't able to have access to that time period. And I see that Professor Mazo has something that he would like to add. I'd like to throw it over to him in order to get his perspective.
Well, I got to get to Jacqueline real quick, but
okay, my apologies.
Mazo, you go ahead, but I'm coming to Jacqueline.
I just gonna a friendly amendment to both what Aaron and Lewis said. Here's the problem with all this, and let me put it in perspective for you. We don't have a baseline of what's fair. So everybody says, to take an example, gerrymandering is unfair, but what's a fairly drawn district look like, right? So let me give you an example. Somewhere between where Aaron is and where Lewis is. In New York, there is no early voting. There's no such thing as early voting, and there's never been such a thing as early voting. You either go to the polls on election day and cast your ballot then, or you just don't vote. Early voting exists in Kentucky. Early voting exists in North Carolina. New Yorkers have never heard of early voting. Now, does that mean that the New York system is fair or unfair? Would you say New York is discriminating against voters or actually respecting the right to vote? Well, the baseline in New York is that there never has been any early voting. And so people don't expect early voting. The baseline in Kentucky is that there's some early voting, and if we take away a few days, people get upset about it. So what I'm trying to show you is, I'm trying to kind of, thread the needle between the two of you here, because the discussion is very interesting, is to show you that there isn't a baseline of what's fair and not fair. The baseline is that once the right is given to you, people don't like it when it's restricted. But in New York, the legislature's never given anybody any early voting, and nobody expects to vote early. No one has ever voted early. And yet we don't think of New York as being some kind of restrictive state. You see what I'm saying? And so this is the thing, is that as citizens, when voting changes, it's up to us to say, and I'll hand it over to Jocelyn in a minute, is to say, hey, why is that change being made? Why is that change happening? And then to say, wait a second, this is harming somebody or helping somebody and hurting somebody else. And then to put your foot down and go to your state legislatures and say, no, I don't want this to happen. But in New York, no one's clamoring for early voting. It's never existed. You want to show up the day before election day, there's nothing you can do. You want to show up the day after election day, there's nothing that you can do. You can only vote on one day. And yet nobody thinks it's fair or unfair because the baseline hasn't changed. What we're talking about now is states where the baseline has changed because of COVID, because of the reasons Aaron told us about. And then after COVID, should we roll back to what we had before, go halfway there, go 3/4 of the way back, 1/3 of the way back? That's what we're talking about, is these baselines changing. Sorry, Jocelyn, I'm sorry.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to come back to you on suppression because I want to understand. Lewis used the term suppression. there is such a thing as voter suppression. I want us to revisit that, but I'm throwing this ball over to Jacqueline.
Okay.
Jacqueline, what in this discussion, in your experience as it relates to Kentucky, is it useful in Kentucky now? Are there things that are not being done? Who do you throw the ball to in terms of making sure that there's access and that folks exercise the right to vote?
Well, and one thing I think that Aaron was talking about at the kind of the end of what he was speaking about, engagement. And I think that's the critical piece and the piece that, you know, AARP has been focusing on, because there were changes, there was rolling back. And where our data was telling us is that for Black Americans, 55% like voting early. And so even if it's from, you know, 2 weeks to 3 days, that's lessening, that's more restrictive. So you have to get that information about those changes out to people in a way that they can understand and provide support so that they can navigate those changes. And that was what the focus of AARP was. There's a website, aarp.org/elections, that has all of this information. There's a website, aarp.org Kentucky Votes, that has the changes. And then there are organizations, not just AARP, but the Louisville Urban League is providing free transportation. I think you're right that you have to push for changes that are make it most accessible to everyone. But in the interim, you know, community organizations and engagement efforts so that people don't get frustrated and give up and stop voting, but letting them know you're so important to be here and vote that we're going to make every effort to see that you get there. And I think that's what AARP is focused on, because there were a lot of changes. And even though the 3-day, I've talked with a number of our volunteers. We had a meeting today. Several of them voted early, you know, last Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. I didn't, because I didn't have a chance last Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. So 3 days was short, but people did take advantage of that. And so now then we can push for more days by showing how successful that was.
Senator Neal.
Yeah, go right ahead.
I was just going to say, if you don't mind, I think New York actually does have early voting. I believe there was a bill that was passed at the beginning of 2020 that allows for a 10-day early voting period. And if we're trying to ultimately decide what voter suppression is, I think ultimately we have to ask the voter. Would you have wanted to vote? Would you have been able to vote if there were these different opportunities available to you? Now, if there was no conception of early voting and everybody felt comfortable, everybody who wanted to be able to vote felt comfortable voting on election day, and no one was prohibited from being able to vote on election day, then great. That is a system that works. But for example, in the state of Texas, whenever you limit the early voting days, whenever you limit the number of polling locations, where those polling locations are, there are people who would have been able to vote otherwise. And by making those changes, that is a form of voter suppression. And I understand the fact that we're having this conversation about what exactly is voter suppression, but ultimately we have to leave that to the voter to be able to define, and that voter wasn't able to do it. That's a form of voter suppression.
We're going to come back and delve a little deeper in that. I'm going to give a nod to WLOU Radio, who was here for the first hour of this discussion. We're going another half an hour. I want to thank the listening audience for engaging with respect to this, and we look forward to programs dealing with policy and issues into the future. Thank you so very much. I gotta switch over just a little bit to Aaron, and then I'm gonna come back to Eugene Mazo, Professor Mazo, and let's have a little discussion about suppression with respect to that. I'm gonna give Aaron a little room though, because I don't want to get Aaron out of his lane. I'm gonna keep him in his lane. Okay, so Aaron, in Kentucky, correct me if I'm wrong, what you do in Jefferson County is not necessarily what they would do in some other county. For instance, Fayette County, or a much smaller county with respect to that. You started off speaking of Jefferson County being the most populous county in Kentucky. What leeway do the county folks have, the Board of Elections, those who are responsible for the clerk's office, what leeway do they have under the statute of the state with respect to that, to the extent you're aware?
Sure. So what I can talk about in terms of what I am aware is that we do have the new laws that govern the state. You know, the policies and procedures that we have in place aren't just a Jefferson County thing. They are a statewide thing. So it is a statewide requirement that you must have some sort of identification in order to be able to vote. But just because you're in Fayette County, that doesn't mean that if you only have an EBT card, or you only have a Social Security card, or you only have a debit or credit card, that they're going to turn you away. You know, I think what you may be asking is when it comes down to the nitty-gritty and the granular kind of aspects, which unfortunately I don't have any insight to be able to speak upon when it comes to how the Fayette County clerk determines where to place the polling sites for that.
But they have the discretion to place it. They make that determination.
So under my awareness, based on how we do things in Jefferson County, we go essentially based upon the precincts and how they are drawn. So it is a combination of both the state and how precincts and districts and dividing lines are drawn. And then we go back through, and we've had people who have been doing maps for decades. And that's one of the things that they even come out of retirement to be able to help us for. So essentially what we do in Jefferson County is we go through and we look at which districts are close enough together to support one polling location. And we'll have an instance where some districts will have maybe 2 or 3 precincts nearby, and they can all come vote at one specific high school, one specific church. Some may have 6. It just depends on a number of factors, including the size of the space, the accountability of the space, the location of the space, because when we go through the precinct process, we want to make sure that as many people as possible have as much access as possible to a polling location. Now, I would hope that that would be the same thing across all the counties, because I do have faith in the system that we have. I do have faith in the county clerks who work alongside Jefferson County Clerk Bobby Hosfall to try and make accessibility to voting a priority. But I cannot speak specifically for them and their own specific styles. I just know how we do it. So I hope that does put it in a little bit of context. But if I could step outside, and I see Louis, I'll wrap up my point here. If I could step outside my current role and speak from some personal knowledge, I was recently the chief Western Kentucky bureau reporter for 44 News that's based out of Evansville, Indiana. So I do have some understanding not only of the counties that I helped cover during my time there, but also across the state, because as a media person, you have to be tuned in to anything else that's going on to be able to have context. I'm not aware of any set of circumstances where, number one, there was a public issue with somebody having access to a polling place, even during 2020. And number two, I'm not aware of any issues that were raised in regards to voter suppression or election integrity across the state. Now, I cannot speak to whether or not that is a fact. That is just my awareness from coming from a media perspective.
That's Indiana.
So in Indiana, that is where we were based for WEVV 44 News, and it is right along the river. And my role in that regard was I was chief Western Kentucky bureau reporter. So it was my responsibility to come back across the river and help cover Owensboro, Henderson, Madisonville, the other counties of Western Kentucky.
Okay, well, that's good. And of course, now that sets me up for the real big question on suppression, because there is Georgia, and there's a lot of reaction to the actions that have been undertaken in Georgia, as opposed to what we're speaking with here. Eugene, what is voter suppression? And give us examples, not just historically, but if you can discern currently.
Well, it's hard to say, because what voter suppression is when the laws change in order to stop somebody who had an easy way of voting to make it harder for that person to vote. Now, if I said to you, Louis has been talking about voter suppression. Does anybody on this panel feel that taking the right to vote away from aliens, in other words, what the law calls aliens, foreigners, is voter suppression. In the United States, we have had states 100 years ago that allowed foreign citizens to vote, Wisconsin, Illinois, because they had to settle those states. And so they allowed foreigners to vote. Or here's another example. We have always, in every single state, except for Maine and Vermont, we have taken away the right to vote from incarcerated felons. First of all, that's a demographic that skews by race and gender very heavily. And there's fights in the states now, in Florida, for example, to in fact, in New Jersey, there was a fight about this, and I testified in front of before our legislature about it. The right in New Jersey has been given back to vote for people on probation and parole, but incarcerated felons are still prevented from voting in 48 states, including Kentucky. So is it voter suppression to take that away from them? That's always been the law in most states. What voter suppression? So you see what I'm saying here? These questions are not easy. And it depends on what your baseline is. Most states have always taken away the right to vote from felons. But why? Some of the people committed felonies that have nothing to do with voting. Or why did some states allow probationers to vote, or people on parole, or vice versa, but non-felons? Some people take it away from all three of them. Florida makes it almost impossible to re-register to vote once you've committed a felony and you're back living in society, because you've got to pay back all of your fines that you've ever owed to the state, including every parking ticket that you've ever had. And most people, that money adds up. So what voter suppression is, we're all going to have a different definition. But what I think it is when the voting rules change to make it more difficult for somebody to vote for whom it was easy before, or just take that right to vote away from somebody that had it before. But today, the game is not taking away somebody's right to vote. We don't just disenfranchise people. We just burden them. We burden certain demographics. I mean, take early voting, right? Take North Carolina and early voting. In North Carolina, the Black population of North Carolina is 22%. But of early voters, the Black citizens of North Carolina, out of all early voters, it's higher than 22%. It's in the 30s, 35%, 38%, 37%, right? So by restricting the number of early voting days, we hit a certain demographic and burden them more than we're burdening other people. That's what voter suppression is. So once you have a rule, I'll give you another example. In Oregon, Washington, and Colorado, we don't have voting in person. Everything is called universal vote by mail. Every single person just gets a ballot in the mail 3 or 4 weeks before the election, and then you mail it back or you put it in a drop box. 90% of people mail it back. What has happened in those states is what we have seen as voting has risen by about 10 or 11%, because people are more educated, they have more time. In Kentucky, we don't have universal vote by mail. Does that mean we're suppressing voters? Well, no, we just have a different system, right? But once we allow people to do something and we take it away from them, that's what voter suppression is. It's making it more difficult for some people or some groups to exercise a right that the state had given to them, and now we're taking it away. I don't know if the rest of you agree with that definition. That's just
I want Louis to tap in here just for a second, regardless of what we call it. Suppression, voter suppression is a neat little word. I know in Kentucky, we're one of the few states that give a life sentence to a convicted felon on voting, except in certain circumstances. And then our governor, by executive order, enabled voters who had a felony conviction to access the voting process through executive order. But yet still legislatively, we've only done that to a limited extent, but not to the extent that the governor has enabled. So in Kentucky, still, that has not become part of the statute. It can be taken away since it was an executive order by the next governor. But Louis, you just heard what Professor Mazo says. He defined voter suppression from his perspective. I can be corrected, of course, may overstate. It's what you take away once you've given it in terms of voting. It's more of a burdening process with respect to that. What's your view and your perspective on that?
I can understand how we ended up getting to that definition. You have a voter. Voter is the predicate, and then you suppress the ability of that voter to be able to vote. I can understand how we got there. And I think ultimately, I have a question for Professor Mezo, if you don't mind. So let's just say you had a group of people. I'm not going to define this group of people, but let's just say you have this group of people that was historically disenfranchised throughout this country's history. And you just never allowed that disenfranchised group of people to ever be able to vote. Would you consider that to be voter suppression?
We have groups of people that are disenfranchised to this day. Ready? Everybody under 18. Are we suppressing voters because we don't allow 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds? Why are we cutting it off at 18 and not 17 or 16 and a half? Is that voter suppression not to allow 17-year-olds to vote?
Well, let me ask you, do you think that is a form of voter suppression, yes or no?
What I'm trying to say to you is that it's hard to answer the question. It's a baseline thing. So if we all of a sudden allowed 17-year-olds to vote, and the next year we took that right away from them, I would call that voter suppression.
Okay.
But
So
most people in this country do not say we're suppressing the rights of green card holders or felons or 16-year-olds because we're not allowing them to vote because they've never had the right to vote.
Well, let me jump in just a minute. Louis, you can define voter suppression.
Yeah, you can define
you
it
want to as well. Go ahead.
I do define it a different way. I do
Go
define
ahead.
it a
Please
different way.
define it.
So for me, voter suppression is when you actively try to minimize or eliminate or actively prevent people from being able to participate in this democratic process. So I'm not trying to have this back and forth and have it be negative by any
No, we're
stretch.
good. Go ahead and define it.
So the question I had for Professor Mezo, I didn't want to put it in black and white terms, but the question that I had ultimately is, if Black people in this country were never given the right to be able to vote, you would not consider that to be voter suppression because the baseline was Black people never had the right to vote to begin with. Is that correct?
There's no
Let me
right
step
to
in. Let me step in just a second. You all forgive me. I'm going to exercise something here if I can. I would like for you, if you will allow me.
Yes, sir.
Because I define that as voter suppression. That does not mean, from the standpoint of how Professor defined it, he defined a context by which he considered it and justified it by rationale as a voter suppression. That doesn't preclude what you just said, because I would put that in the category of suppression too. That doesn't negate what the professor said. What I want to get from you is, what do you consider is voter suppression?
Voter suppression to me, as I define it, is that you actively prevent or limit the different ways that any group of people is able to participate in our democratic process.
So give us examples of that.
Let me give you an example would be, if there is someone who wants to vote by mail, but they do not meet the requirements in order to be able to vote by mail, and they don't want to go to, or they're unable to vote in person, that would be considered voter suppression. If someone has to drive 2 hours in order to be able to get to their polling location, but they don't physically have the time to drive 2 hours to get to the voting location, that would be considered voter suppression. Voter suppression is limiting the ability of someone to be able to participate if, when, and how they want to do so.
But
That
Louis,
is my definition
listen to me for a
of voter
second.
suppression.
Where do you draw that line? I've got a 10-year-old who knows a lot about politics. He's not allowed to vote. Are we engaging in voter suppression by not allowing him to vote? Is that voter suppression?
Wait a minute, wait, here I come again. I got to hear everything Eugene Lewis has to say. Then we're gonna bounce it a little bit, and I gotta come back because I got Aaron's got he's looking straight into that camera, and I gotta get crawling his mind, and Jacqueline, we gotta come back. I just want to fully get what you're saying, and then we'll toss it around a little bit.
Well, I'd like to end up responding to that. I mean, do you think there's a likelihood that your 10-year-old child knows more about the political process than the average person does? If the answer to that question is yes, then we don't truly have a representative democracy if we aren't actively educating people in order to be able to vote in a manner that actually benefits them. If we're going to allow anyone and everyone in order to be able to vote, and they are able to do so in a manner that works best for them, then we actually have a democracy. But if we are just going to limit the people who are able to vote and participate in the electoral process and our democratic process, but they only have to meet a certain set of specifications, whether it's age, race, demographic, or whether it's like where in fact you live in the country, I would consider that not to necessarily be a democracy. A democracy, to me at least, the way that I define it, is where is a type of government in which people are able to participate as they choose to do so in a manner that is not prevented, limited by any kind of government that exists. Now, you may not agree with me, but that is my definition of a democracy.
I don't think you all are disagreeing with each
We're not
other at
disagreeing.
all. I see both definitions for what you call suppression rationalized and the basis upon which they're set upon explained. I see them both valid perspectives with respect to that. Here's what I do see, and where I do want to go, and I'm gonna get back to Aaron just a little bit, and I'm coming back to Jacqueline, is this. It seems to me that we're talking about outside of the outright, you can't vote kind of thing, or outright, let's get this demographic to make sure they don't vote so I can retain power type thing. Aaron, what do you think is the most important thing to increasing voting participation? Because at the end of the day, it also gets down to this practical thing, What do you see as the most thing that would encourage participating in voting? Then I want to go to Jacqueline and have her respond to the same question.
It takes a community, and it takes the community at large making that a priority. At the Jefferson County Clerk's office, we do the best we can to keep engaged with the community. I mentioned that we go out to different community events, and we do the best we can to try and get people registered if they're interested and they're qualified. We try and instill a love of voting from an early age. Prior to COVID, we went into the schools and we talked to kids who were not yet of voting age, but would be, about the importance of voting, to try and bolster and boost the number of younger voters that once they turned 18 and once they started moving into that 24 to 35 demographic that we see as one of the lowest demographics that has participation in Kentucky and in Jefferson County, that love of voting, that recognition of voting isn't lost. But it's not something that we can do alone. We're appreciative that different organizations like the Aarp, like the African American Institute, are so engaged and want to see so many different people voting. We're so glad that we see people who want to step up to be election officers and to take a second step and to serve as guardians of the vote and be involved in the civic duty of being a poll worker. So in terms of being able to get involved, to make sure that people can come and vote, it takes education, it takes accessibility, and it takes enough people to be able to stand up and say, yes, come election day, I'm going to do my part to make sure as many people can come and vote as possible. So we may be kind of the guardians at the gate, as it were, of voting when it comes to making sure that voting remains free, fair, and secure. But we're not the gatekeepers. We're not the ones who are saying you can come in and you can't, you can vote and you can't. We're the ones who are working to make sure that as many possible people can vote within the constraints that are set up for us. So to ensure that voting remains a right here in Kentucky and here in Jefferson County, that as many people as possible can access, we need help. We need the help of legislators in the state, like Senator Neal. We need the help of groups like AARP in Kentucky. We need the help of the Kentucky Cuban societies that we have. So no matter what interest group you might have or be a part of, we all have to come together to be able to make sure that as many people as possible can vote.
Jacqueline, same question. What is it that we can do, or as an individual, not just the people on this call here, but people in any community, because by extrapolation, I would suggest that we all have an obligation, responsibility, and capacity and ability. What do you think should be done to increase engagement at the polls?
Well, I actually agree with everything that Aaron said. I mean, I think he's right on in terms of the engagement piece and how it takes the full community. And as I've mentioned before, I mean, I think that AARP recognized that because specifically in their goals for engagement, they talk about making sure African Americans get to express the rights that they deserve in terms of their homes and their community and protecting them. So there is a specific focus on making sure that African Americans aren't disadvantaged in terms of being able to get to vote, to the places they need to be and to vote. I mean, I also believe that in the kind of bridging the gap, kind of bridging with Lewis, is that for young people and those 50 plus, that it has to be our working together to share the importance. I remember myself and my husband on election day, we took the kids with us, and our poll was in walking distance. We walked to the poll, they saw us vote, we walked back. And today, you know, my kids are in their 20s and 30s and they all vote. I mean, you have to instill how important that is for everyone to vote, and that their voice can be heard. And I really think that for this community, you know, that the more that we do engage, the more power that we will have to be able to address the issues that are keeping those from being able, like those that are incarcerated, you know, increasing, you know, more time early voting. Those things can happen as more people become engaged in the process. So, I mean, it's not perfect. It's not an easy fix, you know, but I do think, and I appreciate the recognition that AARP has been doing this and continues to do it because it's critical. And they've seen the power that voting of 50 plus provides, and it can happen for others as well.
Eugene, I think you raised a very important issue here, and I had not thought of it the way you had defined that, but it's clearly accurate. You give an expectation. I like the issue you gave as it related to New York, for instance, as opposed to, let's say, something that someone's used to and they have an expectation and they act off that expectation, then you take it away. That creates another dynamic. That makes this a difficult discussion. But let me ask you this. My sense of Georgia, for instance, some of the action that's taken in Georgia was not just a taking away, but was intentional restricting of access as it relates to polling places in some counties and some other places in the United States. I'm not saying it's pervasive even, but that seemed an egregious and obvious attempt to quote unquote suppress a certain demographic of votes. We also see that when they deal with student votes, those who have districts that are drawn around colleges and universities in some places, so forth. Would you address that? And would you call that the intentional, or have you observed the intentional, clear, quote unquote, however you define it, suppression of vote?
According to my definition, which, you know, we can debate, and
right,
I'm not wedded to it in any way. I'm more interested in having an interesting discussion and to educate our viewers about how these things are unsettled. Yes, I would say that what's happening in Georgia today is voter suppression. When there are a bunch of polling places that exist in Fulton County and they're overwhelmingly used by African-American voters, and then the legislature goes out and changes the law so that those polling places, there are just fewer polling places. Is somebody preventing you from voting? No, they're burdening your right to vote by making it harder to return that ballot. That's what they're doing. Or making the lines longer, Or a law was passed in Georgia recently that says you can't bring water or food to people who are online in a polling place. Why would you pass a law that says you can't bring water or food to people that are standing online for 4 hours? What's the point of such a law? Why don't you want those people to eat? Because some of those people are going to get hungry and they're going to leave the line and not go vote. That's the point behind these laws. What is the point of a law that says you can't bring somebody food while they're waiting in line to cast their right to vote? Why would you do that? Because the legislature understands perfectly well that some people are going to give up. That's what they understand perfectly well, because the lines are on television and we know how long the lines are. And so that, of course, is voter suppression to me. That law has no point unless you don't want those people to stand online for 6 hours. That's the only reason.
Yeah.
But what I'm trying to say to everybody in this thing is that the right to vote ain't guaranteed in the original Constitution. It's given to you by your state governments, and state governments can take that right away, just as that right has been expanded for some, it's been contracted for others. And if whether that's wrong or right, we can go debate that. But what we all have to do as citizens is catch our states when they're trying to do that thing and say, hey, that's not right. What you're doing is not right. If you want to have fewer days of early voting, give us a reason. Or the lawyer would say, give us a compelling reason for that. And tell us, show us the narrow means used to do that, because that should be held to strict scrutiny. Now, this is nerd talk here about lawyers, but why would you restrict the number of early voting days? You know, if you give somebody 10 days, why would you make it 3? What's the point? Now, Aaron is not a legislator; he's a clerk. So his job is to go and effectuate the laws as they're written. He's not the person writing them. You know, let's not shoot the messenger or anything of that sort. That's not fair. But when a legislature
Haven't
says,
shot him yet.
you got 3 weeks, and now you got 2 weeks, and now you got 1 week. Why are they doing that? What's the, you got to think for yourself. You can't bring food or water. It's now a crime to bring food or water to somebody who's standing online trying to vote. This is what the law says now in Georgia. That's crazy.
Yeah.
That's suppression of me. And I don't care if you use my definition or Lewis's definition. That's suppression. That's voter suppression. That's what it is.
So Lewis, I'm back to you. I saved you for this moment. I listened to what you've said, and I think what I'm hearing, regardless of suppression or whatever we define it as, is that you believe that we should have, that everyone should have a easier access to the polling place. More people should have access to the polling place. And it should not be restricted for what I think I've heard Professor Mazo, our good friend Eugene, say, hey, you have a right to do it, but you know, at some point, what's the rationale for this? And all of that adds up to what for you? What are you saying to that?
I think ultimately,
Not to what Eugene is saying, but to what you're saying.
I think it's true. Like, the fact of the matter is, if we make voting harder, the reason why voting is getting harder is ultimately in order to consolidate power, in order to consolidate political power, in order to make sure that voices like yours, Senator Neal, much like Ms. Stamps, much like Mr. Huber's, much like Mr. Professor Mezzo's, is not able to have the weight of power and influence that it could possibly have. And I also want to say this, if I don't mind, the people who administer our elections, those are some of the most courageous people, because they are truly at the front lines of protecting this democracy. That is the truth. Whether you're an election judge, election clerk, or you're a county clerk, elections administrator, regardless of what position that you hold, you're at the front lines because you are getting the brunt of the scrutiny in order to actively try to give people the access to vote, or whether you're following the law, whether that means preventing people from being able to have access if they don't meet the legal means to be able to do so by whatever is in the state statute, whatever the state legislature decides. And just ultimately, I think the thing we all need to realize is that by the constantly changing laws, we ultimately put our county clerks, our elections administrator in a very tough space, because they also have to implement the laws as they're changing in real time in order to make sure that people are able to have access to the polls. And ultimately, something I say to a lot of the election judges and clerks here in the state of Texas is, if we aren't here to support you, if we don't have people to administer an election, we are unfortunately going to find ourselves in a situation where we can't have one. That's the unfortunate reality of it. And as difficult as it may be, to say that is the truth. So I just want to thank Mr. Hooper for doing the work that he does, because without him doing that work, we'd be in a very difficult and a very different position that we are right now. And just ultimately, the reality is this: I want to have a voting system that gives everyone the opportunity to be able to vote if, when, and how they choose to do so. And I want to make sure that every ballot that is cast is also able to be counted. Ultimately, that is the only thing that I care about. But I also want to make sure that everyone has a voice in this system. Everyone has a voice in the system. Everyone is able to have a say into what the future of this country looks like. And to Professor Mazzo's point, like, he has a 10-year-old child that is very educated. I want that 10-year-old to also have a voice, because their future is also on the line as well. It's not just yours, Senator Neal. It's not just mine. It's not just his. It's not just Mr. Hooper's. It's not just Mrs. Stamps. All of our futures are on the line. And in order for us to truly get to where we hope to be, we all need to have a voice in this process. It can't just be bifurcated based on age. It can't just be separated based on demographic. It can't just be separated on like where you live, who you choose to love, what your ethnicity is, what your healthcare options are. Those are the things that we truly need to gather around, because at the end of the day, those are the things that truly make this country what it is. You spoke about this country being a great democratic experiment. And in order for this experiment to truly work, in order for us to truly be able to see whether or not this experiment can work, is for us to all to be able to participate and have the means to be able to do so.
Ladies and gentlemen, Louis Bedford has the last word. I want to thank my panelists. This was an extraordinary discussion. It was an important discussion. I want to thank Jacqueline Stamps, voter engagement specialist for AARP of Kentucky, Professor Eugene Mazo, Professor of Law, Seton Hall University of Law School in New Jersey, Aaron Huber, representative of the Jefferson County Clerk's Office here in Kentucky, and Louis Bedford, presiding judge for Dallas County Elections Central Count Station and a lawyer himself. I think all was said here. I even gained clarity from this. And I think that this has been invaluable to our listeners. I also want to thank our co-hosts, Cy Boulay of Sigma Pi Phi Fraternity Incorporated, and the AARP of Kentucky, and also the collaboration with WLOU Radio, the National Black Caucus of State Legislators and the Kentucky Legislative Black Caucus, who are on the front line doing this very important work. And that being said, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. We shall return with another issue of importance, but in a democracy, there's not much more important to the health of our democracy but your participation. Thank you and good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening.